Honourable Chair, distinguished delegates, while we appreciate very much the substantive debate right now, we believe that actually this is about integrating, this is about the framework, meaning do we want to have specific goals and targets for developed countries as well as for developing, or is it rather a general thing? Because I think the substantive debate should come tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you.
Simon? Dear Delegate, I would like to echo one of the points raised by Ekbit, that still developed and developing is a very is a changing idea. And then I would like to draw your attention to maybe look more on a South-South partnership, and then develop our targets based on each country's human development index, because developing and developed is basically a GDP idea. We should look beyond GDP. Thank you.
I just want to point out to you as well, like development targets for developed countries doesn't necessarily mean internal targets, but it can mean targets around responsibility to ensure that other countries are being worked with in genuine partnerships, that developed countries are helping to increase resilience, that they're being responsive to the needs and wants in the country, that it's not top-down, as Kenyans already emphasised, and to use a word that we use a lot, which is capacity building. You can set a target for developed countries around capacity building within developing nations in order to achieve the other targets you can set.
Anthony?
I agree with the representative from Red Cross that we need to make these goals sustainable, because you know that in my review paper I wrote it that you need to teach someone how to fish and not how to and not to give him or her a fish. That is the way you can make it sustainable. So in order to make this development sustainable, we have to make sure that we provide the way forward
Japan?
As a coming worker of Japanese International Cooperation Agency, I want to share with you the basic principle of Japanese aid is to promote self-drive. Actually, driving development by yourself, it itself requires for example, you need infrastructure, you need the necessary means of financing. So I think in that sense, with regards to this issue, I think we should talk about the donors, the ODA donors' commitment to this aid for self-drive. I think the distinction between development and developed and developing countries is difficult, but we can, in one way, define it by saying the OECD country, like a donor, and then we can talk about donor commitments. And I'd like to, yeah, okay, never mind, I'm not. Thank you.
Hong Kong.
Our delegates have raised great points about how, about really detailed regarding how we set targets for developed countries and developing countries. So I would like to focus on the generic framework, as mentioned by our delegate from Germany. So I propose that for our global goals, we can have some, as what delegates from the Philippines mentioned, there are goals that apply to both developing and developed countries. Well, of course, the distinction of developing and developed countries we should discuss later on. But there, maybe on a regional level or national level, there will be goals pertaining to developed countries or developing countries. And that relates to what the Red Cross representative talked about as to external targets and internal targets.
Thank you, Delegate. Given the time, we will not recognize another speaker. This moderator focus will expire. Are there any points or motions on the floor?
Motion for a 15-minute moderation caucus, 45 seconds per speaker to discuss whether the framework will be legally binding.
Are there any other points or motions? Australia?
A motion to extend the current moderating caucus by 5 minutes, same speaking time.
Any other points or motions? Philippines?
Motion to set for a moderating caucus on the discussion of time frame for the framework intermediate targets or 1 second for 10 minutes with 45 seconds.
I'll explain the order of voting precedence. We'll vote first
that fails, we will vote on the 5-minute extension of the current moderated caucus on the use of targets for developed countries as well. So bearing that voting precedence in mind, those in favour of the 15-minute moderated caucus on the topic of whether the framework should be legally binding, please raise your right hands now. And those opposed? That motion fails. We now vote on the motion for the 10-minute moderated caucus on the time frame for the new framework. Those in favour, please raise your placards. Those opposed? That motion fails. We now vote on the extension of the current moderated caucus for 5 more minutes. Again, with a speaking time of 45 seconds individually on the topic of whether we should develop targets for developed nations. Those in favour? Those opposed? That motion passes. We now resume the moderated caucus and Australia will be disposed.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Honourable Delegates, I thank you for the discussion that's currently been undertaken. I'd like to propose a twofold way of addressing this issue in terms of developed countries, also bearing in mind the distinction between developed and developing. So first of all, I think we need to, this is more an overarching thing for all countries, we need to recognise the issues within all countries. That applies to both developed and developing, so that we don't need to worry about the blurring boundaries. We just need to recognise that in developed countries as well, there is a lot of marginalised groups. For example, in Australia, the Aboriginal community is quite marginalised, and that's an issue that does need to be addressed. So the second point in the twofold plan is the commitments of the donor nations to LDCs, but also taking into account aid effectiveness and trying to sort of counteract the aid dependence cycle.
Thank you, Ghana.
I propose that as we develop the goals, we have global goals. So the global goals addresses inequalities. But aside that, we can recognize some of the goals. So for developing countries, we have a focus, and then the developed countries will have a focus as well. But in all, we have an AMDA, which is the global goal that we all seek to achieve. That's addressing inequalities. Now, one of the things that we focus on is aid, as the honourable from Australia said. So that aid, for instance, tied aid, could do away with tied aid, right? And then move on with investing aid. So that aid given to developing countries could be invested, as I've been stressing, on the sustainable ventures. And then developing countries to have the focus on.
So, like the delegate of Australia said, the effectiveness of aid is a huge deal. That's a huge part of this discussion that we're having right now, because really, has there been, I don't know, maybe one of the NGOs can answer this, but is there a direct correlation between the amount of aid towards development and progression that developing countries are receiving? That's something we have to think about. What we also have to think about is who is held accountable for development within the developing nations. Right now, all of the developed nations feel that the developed states are, the ones progressing more towards their own, the developing nations' individual targets. So that's what we have to decide. Who's held accountable for these targets?
Grant?
Honourable delegates, as you might know, French people love to complain about everything. I'm very French at that. So I do not settle for the situation in France or in other Western countries. I will never say that the situations are comparable. However, we believe there are common goals to all the countries. For example, nutrition. Some people worry about if they're going to eat in the day. Others suffer from obesity and die for it. There's also water. We're all going to face the scarcity of water in the next few years. Gender inequalities and really all kinds of inequalities. You might not know, but actually slides on that.
Holland?
I think while talking about development aid, of course it is very important that it should be made more effective. However, the most important thing is the private sector. So it doesn't matter if a Western country, let's say the Netherlands, is giving 0 point something development aid, as long as that multinationals go and do business in developing countries, avoiding taxes and not doing sustainable business. That's the biggest problem, and that would also should be addressed in the agenda.
Paula? into the notion of GDP within that developed and developing countries. So I would propose that other indicators such as GNP, gross national happiness, as well as Human Development Index, into setting targets, because this is one of the aspects looking beyond GDP that has been brought on the table during Red+1.
I just want to talk briefly about amount of aid, because it's not necessarily, obviously we all think the amount of aid needs to be increased, but it's also about efficiency, and it's about how governments, the restrictions governments put on that. So one thing that USA does, which is, it makes things really difficult, is that, say you want to distribute condoms, you have to buy them from an American manufacturer, which drastically increases your cost. You can't buy them from an Asian manufacturer, say. So that you have to then make the choice between buying fewer products and being able to help fewer people, or kind of not having that aid. So it's also about the restrictions that developed countries put on their aid that kind of affect effectiveness.
Thank you, Alex. The moderator caucus is now last. Before I ask for any other points or motions, I'll just draw your attention to the fact that our session today goes until 1:30. It's now 12:15. Bearing this in mind, we will be open to a motion for a 2-minute break should you wish to take one. You'll just need to motion to suspend that debate for a 2-minute break. If anyone would like to do that in the next round of motions, feel free. Any points or motions on the floor? Great.
I would like to move to run a moderated caucus of 15 minutes 45 seconds, speakers' times on whether the framework will be legally signed.
Thank you. Are there any other points or motions? Belgium? Motion to suspend for 10 minutes. Any other points or motions? That's right.
Motion for a 15-minute moderated caucus, speaker time of 45 seconds on the time frame.
Okay, so to explain voting and order of voting precedents, we have 2 moderated caucuses of equal time. We'll vote in order they were introduced. So first, the 15-minute moderated caucus on whether the new framework should be legally binding. Second, whether the 15 minutes on the time frame for the new framework. And then on the motion to suspend debate for a 10-minute break. So those in favour of the first moderated caucus of 15 minutes on whether the new framework should be legally binding, please raise your cards now. Those opposed? Those in favour of the moderated caucus on the time frame for the new framework, please raise your cards.